We're constantly battling that pop culture caricature of the bloodthirsty Viking running around in a horned helmet. But the real story of the Norse expansion? Well, it goes way beyond those Hollywood tropes. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are tracking the journey of highly pragmatic explorers, shrewd traders, and incredible adapters who literally push the boundaries of the known world.
And that brings us to a question that sparks endless debate. Did the Vikings actually conquer America? We're going to dive straight into the hard archaeological evidence today to separate fact from fiction. We'll be replacing that whole myth of a grand conquest with a much more thrilling reality of hardcore survival and temporary exploration.
Okay, so to really understand how the Norse navigated the world, we got to look at their beliefs first. Old Norse traditions, they weren't this rigid, structured religion like the Christianity that was dominating Europe at the time. It was much more of a lifestyle rooted in oral traditions and deities like Thor and Odin. But here's the catch. Christians weren't really supposed to trade with pagans. So the Norse didn't just blindly clash in holy wars over this. No, they adapted. Lots of merchants simply underwent what they called temporary christenings. Now, it wasn't a full baptism, but it was just enough to show a willingness to accept Christianity. And boom, that secured those absolutely vital, lucrative trading routes across Europe.
Talk about cultural flexibility, right? This was incredibly pragmatic. There's this great quote from scholar Thomas A. Dubois who puts it perfectly. He says Nordic religion could be seen as both an artifact of its past and a reflection of its present. And we have actual physical evidence of this blending. Imagine walking into a shop in the medieval city of Hedeby, and you could buy a Christian cross and a Thor's hammer in the exact same place. Over in York, they minted coins that literally stamped St. Peter's name right next to Thor's hammer. Even those gorgeous Norwegian stave churches, which were built centuries later, feature roofs lined with fierce dragon carvings sitting right alongside Christian crosses. It was just this constant, super practical mix of the old and the new.
Geographically speaking, this pragmatism fueled a relentless push westward. This spatial arc here is honestly breathtaking. Think about it, starting from early 8th century Christian missions in Denmark. Then you skip to 985 where Erik the Red, who, fun fact, was banished from Iceland for manslaughter, establishes a foothold way out in Greenland. Then, less than 40 years after that, by the year 1021, the Norse are literally chopping down trees on the shores of modern-day Canada. That is a staggering pace of expansion.
All right, let's jump into Section 1, the Greenland Base Camp. So that settlement Erik the Red established in Greenland, it tested their adaptability to the absolute limit. You really have to wonder, how on earth did they survive in such an unforgiving environment for nearly 500 years? Well, they certainly couldn't rely on traditional European-style farming. Survival meant getting highly functional. They relied heavily on something called the Nordsetur. This was an incredibly perilous, communal hunt for migratory harp seals that happened every single spring, basically to stave off starvation. And for the things they simply couldn't make themselves, they traded. They sent valuable exports like walrus tusks, polar bear skins, and narwhal tusks back to Europe, and in exchange they got vital imported lumber and iron ore.
And honestly, they were remarkably successful for a good while. At its peak, the Greenland North population hit anywhere between 2,000 to 3,000 people. Now sure, that might seem like a tiny town to us today, but back then, this was a highly complex functioning society made up of hundreds of farms, sitting quite literally at the edge of the known medieval world. But it was also an incredibly fragile society, totally dependent on very delicate environmental balances.
Moving on to Section 2, reaching North America. So, a big question, why keep pushing west? It definitely wasn't some grand desire for conquest. Honestly, it was just the sheer barrenness of Greenland and a desperate need for timber that motivated their push toward the forested coasts they called Markland and Vinland. Which brings us right to Land's All Meadows. Located way up at the northern tip of modern-day Newfoundland in Canada, it remains the one and only archaeologically confirmed Norse settlement in all of North America.
Now, what makes Land's All Meadows so fascinating is the sharp contrast between what archaeologists actually found there and what they didn't. On one hand, we have boat repair workshops, a bronze cloak pin, and even butternut wood that had to come from further south, which is huge because it proves they sailed down into the Gulf of St. Lawrence. But here's the crucial part. There are 0 graves. No livestock pens, absolutely no signs of agriculture. What does this tell us? It proves this was never a permanent colony. It was just a temporary way station, basically a staging area used mostly for fixing up their boats before making the long trip back to Greenland.
And thanks to some absolutely incredible scientific forensic work, we know exactly when they were there. Listen to this.
scientists tracked a very specific carbon-14 spike in the wood at the site. That spike was caused by a massive solar storm way back in the year 993. So by counting the tree rings outward from that spike all the way to the bark, they securely locked in the exact moment those trees were chopped down by metal Norse axes. The year? Exactly 1121 AD. Literally no question about it. This is the very first secure calendar date we have for Europeans crossing the Atlantic. Mind-blowing, right?
Okay, let's look at Section 3, Climate Change and Decline. So, despite reaching North America, these intrepid pioneers eventually just vanished. Why? Well, it was a really devastating chain of compounding vulnerabilities. First off, you had the Little Ice Age, which brought in a much cooler, way more humid climate packed with severe storms. That completely disrupted those vital spring seal hunts we talked about. Secondly, a recent study actually showed that the growing mass of the Greenland ice sheet pressed the land downward. This caused local sea levels to rise by up to 3.3 meters. It literally flooded their coastal farms. And third, right as all of this is happening, the European market for their main cash crop, walrus ivory, just plummets because they're suddenly competing with African elephant ivory. It was this perfect storm of sinking economics combined with extreme climate change that ultimately doomed the settlements.
In the end, it was incredibly quiet. The very last written record we have from Norse Greenland isn't some great battle. It's just a simple, deeply human detail. A marriage, recorded at a local church in the year 1408. Shortly after that wedding, the eastern settlement just fell silent, and the Norse entirely disappeared from the historical record in Greenland.
Which brings us to Section 4, Fake Runes and Forgeries.
Now skip ahead centuries later, and the public's absolute obsession with this idea of a grand Viking conquest led to what we call pulp history. When we look at the actual hard archaeological facts, they are firmly rooted in Canada. But compare that to the stuff pushed largely in the United States, things like the Kensington Runestone or the Vinland Map. These supposed artifacts claiming a deep, lasting Norse presence in New England and the Midwest, yet they are overwhelmingly rejected by scholars as complete hoaxes.
Let's look at the specific forensic debunking of probably the most famous one, the Kensington Runestone, which was allegedly dug up in Minnesota back in 1898. Now, the stone explicitly dates itself to 1362, but linguists very quickly noticed a problem. It contained anachronistic runes, letters that literally were not used in the 14th century. Plus, get this, it used a place value number system derived from Arabic numerals, which was entirely out of place for that era in Scandinavia. Scholars actually matched these linguistic oddities directly to a 19th century code used by a Swedish tailor. So yeah, a complete forgery.
So you might be wondering, why go through the trouble of making these hoaxes in the first place? Well, historians like Annette Kolodny and Gordon Campbell have documented exactly how Norse history was co-opted. In the 19th century, various political groups, including white supremacist movements, basically created what Kolodny calls plastic Vikings. They were deliberately manufacturing evidence to push fictional origin myths. Depending on who was talking, they portrayed these Vikings either as perfectly civilized Christians or as these rugged, heroic conquerors, whatever happened to suit their specific political agendas at the time.
And that really leaves us with a provocative question. If the real Norse history, this incredible, true story of grit, survival, immense pragmatism, and adaptation at the very edge of the world, is so deeply fascinating, why do we still prefer the pulp history of plastic Vikings? Think about that. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the history you think